Well, thanks very much, Chris. I'd also like to add my congratulations to Christina and to Lars for their vision and leadership over the last 10 years. It's been outstanding. In case you're wondering if I've got the slides upside down, in fact I don't. This is MacArthur's corrected map of the world, which, is this the light? Which puts Melbourne actually at the top of the world, up here. And that's our trauma centre at our hospital. Today I'm going to talk on the history of trauma in Australia, and this is a fascinating story that took place over some 30 years from 1970. I come from the Alfred Hospital and from Monash University. In Australia in 1950 there were 1,643 road fatalities in Australia and over 30,000 injuries with a total of 5.2%. This was with a population of 8.2 million and 1.4 million registered vehicles. By 1970, that figure had risen to 3,798 fatalities. In Victoria, our state, in 1965 there were 907 fatalities. By 1967 there were 963, and the figures were rapidly rising, not only in Victoria but in all states. We had an epidemic on our hands. Trauma was the leading cause of death under the age of 44 years and third to cardiovascular disease and cancer in all age groups. In 1967, the Victorian Parliament established a Joint Select Committee on Road Safety and recommended in 1969 that seat belts be fitted to all passenger vehicles and that they be made compulsory for learners and probationary drivers, government drivers and all occupants within 2 years. However, there was a lot of resistance to this concept, and the Premier and the Deputy Premier themselves were opposed, and a number of civil liberty groups. At this stage, the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons entered the fray. In 1969, a symposium on road trauma was held, and the government was encouraged to enact seatbelt and .05 blood alcohol legislation, and a road trauma standing committee was established. This was based in Victoria, and the first meeting was held in February 1970, and the aims were to collect and evaluate data on patterns of injury, to assess evidence of preventative measures, to evaluate treatment and to develop practical applications. The committee was led by Bill Hughes, who was a dynamic chairman and president of the college at the time. And there were representatives of all states and New Zealand, because this is a combined college. The first meeting in May 1970, Hughes insisted that statements be based on scientific fact, that recommendations had practical implementation, and that all specialties should be involved. And these were departures from the routine exercise by the college before that. They actually took the step of employing a journalist, Donald Gibb, as a media expert. And they approached stakeholders in all areas associated with road trauma. Harry Gordon, who was the editor of the Sun News Victorial, wrote an editorial in November 1970 called "Declare War on 1034" when the fatalities rose to over 1,000 for the first time in a single year. The strategy worked. On the 22nd of December 1970, seatbelt legislation was passed by the Victorian government, and on the 1st of January 1971, the legislation was enacted. It became mandatory for front seat occupants to wear seatbelts when fitted. A world first. This was the first time this has actually been done. The effects were dramatic. By June 1971, driver casualties were reduced by 19.7%, and a 1972 survey showed that 75% of drivers were wearing seatbelts, indicating really quite high compliance with the new concept. In Melbourne, the road deaths were reduced by 25% in 3 years, whereas in the other state capitals where the program was not introduced, the fall was only 1.2% in 3 years. Serious injuries were reduced, and spinal injuries were reduced by 27%. At the same time, the issue of alcohol was addressed, and Grayton Brown, who was the deputy chairman of that committee, pointed out in 1970 that the 10 Australian road deaths were occurring each day, and 48% of them were due to alcohol. This was regarded as the single most important contributing factor to road fatalities in Australia, as McDermott and Trinker pointed out in 1983. A working party chaired by Don Beard from South Australia was set up, and they identified the risk factors as Friday and Saturday nights and young and probationary drivers, who held 13% of the licences but were involved with casualties in 28%. The conclusion was that compulsory blood alcohol testing should be carried out on road casualties. And again, there was marked opposition to this, as you could imagine, from civil liberty groups and particularly the breweries. However, despite all that, compulsory blood alcohol testing was introduced in Victoria and South Australia in 1973 and 1974 and limited to accident victims over the age of 15. McDermott analysed the data resulting from this legislation and showed that there was a high correlation between alcohol and road trauma in Victoria, with 50% of drivers and 33% of motorcyclists having a blood alcohol of 0.05% after fatality. This was the subject of his Hunterian lecture to the Royal College of Surgeons in England in 1978 and has since been confirmed by a plethora of other studies. This, coupled with the probationary drivers issue of inexperience, led to zero alcohol levels being recommended for probationary drivers. This legislation was enacted in Victoria in 1984 and it was followed in other states in Australia. Random breath testing was introduced and increased. The third issue was speeding, and in Australia the highway speed limit was limited to 100 kilometres an hour. And in built-up areas to 60 kilometres an hour. We don't have the autobahn systems that you have here as much, but certainly on the other roads that was the rule. This resulted in a further 20% reduction in the road toll. However, there were two sides to the coin. Tom Reeve, who was then the college president, pointed out that the college needed to put their own house in order. So the committee was expanded to include more personnel to take on a bigger task. They continued to address the issues of seatbelts, alcohol and speeding, but it was recognised that data collection, hospital reception of facilities, early management of trauma for surgeons, ambulance officer training and liaison with specialist groups were all deficient. A standing committee on road trauma was established to improve data collection. Up until then, few hospitals had been collecting comprehensive data. Gordon Trinker had collected some at Pancha Hospital in Melbourne, and Peter Ryan was appointed to select a hospital in each state to begin collecting data. Peter Nelson had retrieved some data from pattern of injury survey forms from ambulance forms which were submitted. And this, in fact, was the largest world study on road trauma at that time. As a result of all this work, Gordon Trinker was invited to address the USA Congressional Inquiry on road trauma in 1977. In an effort to try and improve the management, particularly of the surgeons involved, the early management of severe trauma course was introduced. The aims were to train surgeons in rapid, accurate assessment, make resuscitation a priority, assess the need to transfer, and to provide optimum care at all stages. The first course was conducted in 1988, and by 2003, over 8,000 practitioners had completed the course. In 2000, it was made a component of basic surgical training in Australia. Since then, many overseas graduates and other health professionals have undertaken the course, and this has been a very successful venture. McDermott entered the fray again, this time dealing with bicycle helmets, and he promoted the use of voluntary helmets, which resulted in a 39% reduction in head injuries in cyclists. By 1990, the mandatory legislation was introduced, which resulted in a 70% serious injury reduction in bicyclists. And this was the second Hunterian lecture he gave to the College of Surgeons in 1995. In 1991, the Trauma Committee was expanded to become a trauma committee rather than just a road trauma committee. And in 1992, a new document on trauma was established, revised from the original 1978 document. They continued to address the issues related to road trauma with .05 and zero alcohol legislation, speed control, safe driving and fatigue, bicyclists, vehicle equipment and environment. But also addressed injuries in other areas such as farm injury, sports injury, workplace injury and disaster medicine. They recognised that management was important and that trauma systems needed to be developed and treatment needed to be improved.